Well, we're here with Minister Horner, fresh off the heels of completing Alberta's Q1 fiscal update, one of the requirements of being finance minister in this province. And Mr. Horner, there are some fiscal updates where we say, okay, well, that was pretty much as planned. The numbers are coming in about the same as they were planned in the budget. And this is not one of those fiscal updates. Some new information here. So maybe I'll just ask you off the top, give us your top line. What's the headline of this fiscal update?
I think the big piece that would catch most people's eye and attention is the increase in surplus. So at budget 2024, we were projecting a fairly modest $350 million surplus, and we're adding about 2.6 billion to that at first quarter. So the surplus projected for this year is 2.9 billion after first quarter. Most of that from oil and gas, bitumen, but also an increase in personal income taxes to the tune of what, $500 million.
And in your update, so you mentioned those two things, and maybe you can dig into them just a little bit more for us. So driving the surplus, we've got oil and gas, royalty revenues, and personal income tax. And what's the reason for the personal income taxes being up? I think it has something to do with population.
Definitely. Yeah. We also upgraded our population growth number from 3.7% to 4.6. So population growth certainly isn't slowing down. And it feels like Stats Canada and economists are always a little behind on their estimations of where it truly is. So we're still seeing people come here in droves. It's a little spooky because, yeah, you'll get a little uptick in PIT, but you know all the pressures that are soon to follow in health and education and SCSS. So
Mhm.
good news for today, but a lot of abundance of caution going forward.
Many of these factors remind me of the sort of the feeling of good problems to have in Alberta, but good problems still create some problems at the same time, right? Having a big surplus number is certainly better than the opposite. Lots of people wanting to come to Alberta is certainly good, but talk to us about some of those pressures, some of the trade-offs that are involved in budget making under these circumstances.
So for your listeners, it hasn't been that long since we laid down a table budget 2024. So
Mhm.
we do expect our ministers and departments to live within that budget, especially in the early days. We want to know about the pressures that they're tracking and seeing, but we've told most of them to bring them to second quarters. We'll look at addressing some of those in November. Except education, we did put 125 million into education to deal with unfunded enrollment growth in the first quarter. But one of our challenges is under our fiscal rules, we have a $2 billion voted contingency.
Mhm.
So those pressures are there, they're coming, but you're trying to keep some powder dry as you deal with, forest fires and the other disasters and unavoidable things that will come to you throughout the year. We definitely want to deal with the ministries and those pressures. I'm sure SCSS will be coming back. Health, physician compensation pressures are very real and very population driven. So a lot of these are just mechanical due to more people.
You touched on one there that I wanted to jump on. As we record this, we're sort of in the tail end of what is usually the big natural disaster season, certainly the wildfire season. How has the natural disaster season shaped up this year, both for the government and especially on the fiscal side of things?
If it was over today, it would be a lot better than last year. We're still forecasting about 550 million in wildfire fighting, suppression, mitigation, and another 23 million to date, Red Cross matching donations, evacuee payments. But it's likely it will go higher than that for sure. Last year, we ended up at almost 800 million. So last year was extremely material.
Right.
But yeah, that's how it's always been done in the province is that it comes out of contingency. You don't have a high budgeted item. You deal with it as it comes. So
Hmm.
it's a year to year challenge. And, these things are becoming more expensive. It's something you definitely want to more than keep an eye on and try to keep some powder dry as you get into the year.
Yeah, there's even been some talk in past years of changing how we might budget for natural disasters, right? Given that it, is this contingency item, low beginning budget, but it just sort of keeps coming in as a high budget item year after year.
Yeah, lots of debate about that. We continued the way we have historically, although we did add, baseline funding for some new wildfire teams and some other items. So it is a big increase to forestry's budget overall. But you don't want to create your own industry either. Like I
Mhm.
think if you can separate a few of those things, it'd probably be very warranted to increase the funding for different fire break programs for communities north of the tree line and try to really focus on the mitigation in the year to year budgeting and then
Mhm.
deal with a lot of the disaster firefighting as it comes.
As a kind of one-off. Yeah, certainly something that's very present in our minds in this year when, a huge portion of Jasper burned down. And we've been working actually primarily with your colleague, Matt Jones, on some of the recovery items relative to the business community there. So something we're absolutely all thinking about and still, on how we rebuild that beautiful crown jewel that we have in Jasper.
It's going to take a while, but I know there's many tables formed and all levels of government doing their best to make sure it's expedited, but it will take some time.
Yeah, doing the best we can. I saw a social media message from you that you're still very focused on delivering the personal income tax cut that your government's been talking about. Talk to us a little bit about where that stands today and how you might fit that in with all the other various pressures that we're discussing.
It is a pressure in my mind because it's been promised, and we've communicated that we will do something with it in budget 2025. I'd said at budget 24 that we would legislate in 25 and then bring it forward in two pieces in 26 and 27. But the premier definitely would like to see that accelerated. So I can't give you any detail. It hasn't gone through cabinet, but people would definitely like to see that advanced and accelerated. So I think one way or another, we will make it clear in budget 25.
And just for the benefit of our listeners and everyone's memory, this was one that you pushed a year further down the road. Is that correct? To accomplish some budget making the last year? Just remind us how that played
Yeah,
out.
the campaign promise was to bring in an 8% bracket for income up to $60,000. It's about a $1.4 billion hit or reduction
Mhm.
to revenue over the full year. So we're getting our feet wet and preparing that first budget, and it became clear in a hurry that we wouldn't be able to bring that forward in the first year without running a substantial deficit. So I had asked the premier and team for a little time, and we're bringing it forward as soon as we can. But it's about a $1.4 billion change in revenue.
And we think that was probably a prudent approach to take some time to make sure that you can get the budget in the right shape. When that tax cut comes forward, what's that going to mean for the average Alberta family, if you could put it in those terms?
I know during the campaign, the math said about $750 per Albertan, or potentially double that for a household. I think we'll update those numbers to make sure that those are accurate, but somewhere in that range of
In
impact.
terms of the order of magnitude, yeah. So for
Yeah.
people to think about what that could mean in terms of their family budget, that gives you a sense of where it falls. Yeah, a material, meaningful amount of money for an Alberta family. Absolutely. For a long time, I've thought that big surplus numbers in Alberta and the ups and downs of our budget cycle, they create problems on the downside and also challenges on the upside as well. And I think one of those ones that you might have looming for you is public sector negotiations. Can you talk to our listeners a little bit about what that challenge is going to look like and what you anticipate there?
Yeah, I would definitely not want to get into any details or make it sound like I'm talking outside of the process. The
No,
process
certainly not.
is very live currently. Their tables are open and they're in live negotiations. But just to get an idea of how dramatic the impact is to public sector bargaining, if you look at the province's books, we have about say 31.5 billion in total public sector compensation, salaries, wages,
Mhm.
and benefits. That includes physicians. So it's about 25 for the rest of the public service, almost 50% of our expenditure. When you're talking, are you going to add a point or two or an extra point here and there? It adds up pretty quick. I think it's close to 300 million a point per year. So it can change in a hurry. So we definitely want fair settlements with all of the public sector workers in Alberta. And frankly, we need them. For decades previous, I think Alberta was an outlier through the process change, having a coordinated bargaining table. I think the province has done a good job to get down to market with our, Ontario West provincial comparators. And I think that's where we sit today. So
Mhm.
I think everyone's expecting to be a decent increase, seeing the settlements that have happened in the provinces beside us, and especially in a more detailed way, the provinces where we compete for that specific labor. So I'm optimistic that they'll be able to reach a fair deal because across the country, everybody's short. Healthcare workers, really just people.
Yeah, and in particular healthcare, though, as you point out, and yeah, we recently put out a piece looking at Alberta's labor market, and one of the sectors that's still really feeling the sort of labor shortage, even though it's eased in many others, healthcare is still feeling it in a big way, and so we're going to need those people, especially as our population continues to surge. One other question on the numbers, and then I want to talk to you about what you want to do going forward, some of the policies that you sort of signaled in this update. But people have been writing and calling us about a topic that we don't talk about that often, which is labor market transfer agreements, LMTAs. Tell us what's happening there and how that affects, your budget at the moment, and what are people mad about?
Well, yeah, the labor market transfer agreement was kind of a flow through joint program with the federal government, and the feds quit funding it in their spring budget. Some would say without communicating that clearly to the provinces. So the provinces were expecting, those flow through offset dollars, and it was kind of built into the program that they felt they were offering. So we had, if memory serves, I think it was like 625 million was the total program between all the provinces, and Alberta's share was something like 70 million or
I believe
70.
70 is the number I had in my head. Yep.
Yeah, a big chunk of that's in advanced education, but I believe it impacts six ministries. Definitely Indigenous relations, transportation, jobs economy, trade, SCSS, immigration and multiculturalism, maybe. Currently, they're dealing with that in year now that they know the money's not coming. So it's not like I'm going into the contingency to find the money in year. They haven't asked for that yet. So they're dealing with it in year. And the conversation's very alive. I guess they'll see what they think the need is, and if there's a gap that needs to be filled by the province, or if they will kind of reel in some of this programming.
Now, the feds that we've talked to say that they feel that they signaled this well in advance that this portion of the funding was going to be coming to a halt. But your view is that you didn't feel you had enough notice on it?
When it became clear to me that it probably wasn't being funded was in December. So we were in the middle of our budget process. And I only learned that because I found that my other finance minister colleagues from across the country believed that to be the case at our FPT meeting. But when I kind of relayed that information back to my team, that wasn't their feeling. They thought that within their colleague ministries, they felt that there was a chance that it was coming and that it was being reviewed. So clear or not, it didn't come, and, and we're going to deal with it now.
Sure. So some difference of opinion on how that was communicated. But yeah, I think one of the areas that certainly I've heard from businesses and Albertans that they're seeing this is in the Canada-Alberta Jobs Grant sort of being stopped relatively early this year as a result of the funding drying up. And certainly feels like a time when we need probably more skills training, not less skills training. So I think a conversation that's going to continue to go on.
Definitely.
Let's just take the last bit of our time together and talk about the forward looking, because we always say that budgets and fiscal updates aren't really just budgets and fiscal updates. They're really policy signaling exercises as well, in terms of where the government's priorities are going to be, because where the money goes, that's where the priorities go. As part of this fiscal update, you announced a number of priorities. Why don't you just top line for our listeners what a couple of those are, and we can dive into them?
Well, definitely. No, thanks, Scott. I'd say if I'm thinking about areas of priority and what was signaled at Q1, I think about healthcare and education first. Definitely with the population surge that we're seeing, we're going to have to really focus on those areas and kind of rising to the challenge of what a 4.6% population growth looks like and means, especially on building of schools. Some of those things are going to become dominant themes for this
Mhm.
term, unavoidable themes. But I do think you mentioned the provincial personal income tax cut. That's definitely a theme for me because I've been tasked with it, and I've promised to bring it forward. So
That's your job to get done. So that's an important one.
my job to get done, so we're going to do it. Yeah, that's right. And affordability is still front of mind for everyone, and it's one of those things that people think the government has a lot of levers, but there isn't as many good ones as people might think.
Mhm.
I think the other one that's important to me that we'll be able to communicate a little more clearly this fall is just kind of evolution and strategy around the Heritage Fund going forward. I think the province has been very obviously we're tax averse people, and we don't forget. We can remember the time when we had none. But I think going forward, if you're going to save in an environment when you're also growing and your revenues are still volatile, I think Albertans really need to get behind the idea of focusing on the net position of the province.
Mm.
I've kind of tried to make that resonate and make sense to people in that, you might have a mortgage on your house, you might have RSPs in a savings account. Maybe you could get out of your RSPs and pay off your mortgage, but would you? Would that be prudent? And I
Mhm.
think that makes a lot of sense when you look at the position the province is in as well. It's a bit of a departure from where we've been in the past. Keep it simple. If you have a surplus, pay down debt.
Right. And just expand on that a little further. So, how are you trying to get Albertans to think about this differently in terms of the net position? What do you mean by that?
I think if you looked at our current fiscal state after Q1, we are still going to be incurring some borrowing
Hmm.
for the capital plan, the other cash requirement needs, but we are in a fairly substantial surplus of, $2.9 billion. But that's what happens when you have assets that are accruing value like the Heritage Fund, but you can't deploy them. You kind of got two sides of the ledger. So I think if that's going to be successful and people are going to be, committed to leaving that money there, which it should, it's a great strategy. They're going to need to understand why that's important.
Hmm. I think that's an important part of the job to communicate that to Albertans. As Albertans, we'd prefer to have no debt whatsoever. But at the same time, I think we've looked at our history and said we probably could have done a better job of saving in the good times and have built up a bigger, I guess, war chest for the future or dividend to our grandchildren or that kind of thing. So I think it's important to continue that work. And I applaud you for doing it.
We're bullish on changing the way the fund is thought of and even invested. But even if you look at the historical numbers, the last 10 years with costs out, the fund's done about 7.3%. Our debt is currently under four, anyways.
Right.
There's quite a delta there if people can, focus on that value. But I also think that, you know, looking at the net debt to GDP for a growing economy is also important. And at this Q1, we saw that come from about 9.3 down to 8.6. We were forecasting it ending up at about 7.7, under 8% by the end of this term, which is frankly unheard of. And very much the opposite of what we're seeing in the other provinces. Like we're seeing BC's position deteriorate over this term from about 15 to 30% over the course of a term.
Hmm.
That's pretty real. And we've seen, I don't know what we've seen, 6 credit rating increases in the last 2 years. So the rating agencies like the fiscal framework. They understand it. They see the value in savings. So now we just have to make sure Albertans understand it.
Let's end on that population growth story. Just a few months ago, actually, you sat in a boardroom in our offices and talked to folks about the need to build more houses. I've rarely seen a finance minister who could rattle off the number of housing starts and the population growth numbers off the top of your head the way that you could. How are those numbers looking today? So, how many people did we add last year, and how many folks do you think Alberta is going to increase by this year?
Yeah, well, it's pretty wild numbers. We increased by net around 200,000 people.
So, like a Lethbridge and a Red Deer, basically, you could imagine we added. Yeah.
Yeah, that is just crazy to think about. But yeah, we're seeing, like I said, we had to update our forecasted numbers from 3.7% to 4.6. If that holds true, the numbers within this year would be even more dramatic. The housing
Above that 200,000 number. Yeah.
the housing start numbers are crazy. I may have had them on the top of my head that day. I'm afraid I don't today.
You don't have to today. No.
I would say they're consistently breaking records, like they're building on themselves. The construction community is really kind of accumulating mass right now. And if they don't break it the month over month, they come in second, and then they break it the month after that. And it's Calgary and Edmonton, a lot of growth elsewhere as well, but especially the multi-dwelling, multi-unit housing in Edmonton's been something to watch. So I know the community, the construction community, that they think that they're doing a good job, offering, diversified product as well, not just single detached, but multi-dwelling, lower income, affordable. So they're going to need to. It'll stay like that for a while. And
Oh,
honestly,
yeah.
that's the big sector that's pushing up GDP is home construction.
I don't think construction's going anywhere anytime soon when you think about that, having added 200,000 people last year, a Lethbridge and a Red Deer roughly. And if we're going to add that again this year, imagine every home, every business, every school in those communities. And we've got to build that much again.
Yeah, it's a conversation we had when we're on these, capital markets, trips. People are sincerely curious how we're going to handle this and why. They want to know why the people are coming. Like they see a population number over 3.5, and they're like, "This is like a GDP number." They don't get how that's possible.
How do you answer that when you're on these trips?
I steal a line I've heard you use that we're doing a lot of things right, I think, but we truly are the fastest skater on a slow team in a lot of ways. A lot of it is we're obviously seeing more than an outsized share of Ukrainian evacuees. The NPR numbers are still high, but the interprovincial migration numbers are very strong. So that's Canadians choosing And I blame a lot of that on the fact that there just is little opportunity elsewhere. In the spring, stat I found just kind of crazy and spooky was that for the 6 months previous, this was maybe in March or April, for the 6 months previous, 90% of the private sector jobs in the country were created in Alberta.
Yeah.
And, maybe that's an anomaly with, one big project in that period, but that should scare everyone in this country.
I almost fell off my chair when I saw that number. You've just outlined, I think, what's the classic reason why people have come to Alberta, which is opportunity. That's what brought my family here, and I think a lot of other families here. And sounds like that's what's driving us again today.
Yeah, definitely there was an affordability gap in the housing compared to, the other
Mhm.
big cities in the country. And we've seen that decrease somewhat, I would say, but it's still a sizable gap. So I think you'll see people continue to come as long as that's the case.
No better place to leave it than a note of opportunity and people wanting to come to Alberta. Minister Horner, really thanks a lot for your time and for outlining the fiscal update for all of us.
You bet. Yeah, thank you very much, Scott. My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us today. And if you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and giving us a quick review and a rating, or tell a friend about the show.